thinking about, gosh, we need to do something to honor this fabulous and most interesting history, West Virginia history, the Mine Wars. And then we had something lined up actually with Chuck Keeney. He's probably forgotten now, but COVID killed that. As you know, it has put the damper on a lot of things that we tried to do. So this is really fabulous tonight that we have the brainchild of Doug Estep and Chuck Keeney and all of their fine work. But I want to welcome you on behalf of Shepherd University. Thank you all for coming out, for being here. I want to also thank the Byrd Center and Jody Brummage, who is such a terrific person. He does so much for all of us, a really great partner. Another partner is Karen Rice and Lifelong Learning, and of course, the Center for Appalachian Studies and Communities. So it gives me a lot of pleasure tonight to be able to introduce this amazing panel that Doug Estep has gotten together. So Doug has done a wonderful, wonderful job. We have Judge David Hammer, who is the supervising judge of Jefferson County, and he has been very much involved and interested in historic Jefferson County. And he has, we had dinner with all of these people before this event, and it was fascinating listening to him. Each one of these persons is a treasure trove of information and ideas, and they're coming at it from a lot of different directions. So we welcome him. We have over here Chuck Keeney, who's sitting at the end. So Chuck is the great grandson of Frank Keeney, and I was just teaching Frank Keeney the other day, and he's one of the colorful, wonderful parts of West Virginia history, and frankly, the history of this country. Dr. Charles Keeney is a history professor. He's an author, he's an activist, and he has been, of course, with this family history, so interested in the business of the mine wars and the charges for treason and so on. He's worked to protect and share the heritage of the mine wars, and his most recent book, The Road to Blair Mountain, chronicles his work as president of the activist group called Friends of Blair Mountain, and their successful efforts to protect Blair Mountain. They were going to mow that one down too, but thanks to Dr. Keeney, that will not happen. So we're very happy to have him with us. We also have with us, of course, Doug Estep, and Doug first discovered the story of the mine wars as a freshman at WVU, and he's been a devoted student of West Virginia history, and particularly this area of West Virginia history now for 40 years. He owns and operates Cole Country Tours, and he, as well as Dr. Keeney, have appeared on the American Experience documentary of the Mine Wars. I know that many of you have probably seen this. It's really, I mean, it was a wonderful thing, I think, when the story of these miners first came to us. For a long time, their story was obscured by the charges of being Reds and the charges of being communists and all of the other things that they try to do to keep these extraordinary men who and women who work so hard to bring changes about in the unions and so on and so forth. So Doug resides in Shenandoah County, Virginia, with his wife, Carol. We also have with us tonight Cecilia Mason. Cecilia, you'll recognize her voice. She was involved with Inside Appalachia. She's a media personality. She works now at Shepherd University with the University Communications Office. And we are extremely pleased tonight to have Denise Jardina with us. So Denise has been with us on this campus before. She received the 2002 Appalachian Heritage Writers Award, which was awarded by the Shepherd University Foundation and the West Virginia Humanities Council. She is a two-time recipient of the Weatherford Award for her significant work in Appalachia and telling the Appalachian story in Stormy Heaven and The Unquiet Earth. She's been a winner of the Chafin Award, the Fisk Fiction Prize for Saints and Villains. And as I have said many, many times, that I think Saints and Villains is one of the great novels of this or any century. It's a great book. It's a book that deals with moral ideas. It's the story of Bonhoeffer, and it ties that story of Holocaust to West Virginia. It is also a remarkably artful book in the way it's put together. If you have not read Saints and Villains, you should read that one as well. So this is an illustrious group that we have, and we have basically these people here thanks to Doug and thanks to Chuck Keeney. But Doug has been really the person that spearheaded this. He has a lot of events. There's been one event already that's taken place, and there are going to be events on May 6th, May 13th as well. A lot of things going on in Charlestown, and Doug is going to talk a little bit about that first, and then Cecilia is going to come up here, and Cecilia will be the moderator. But Doug?
Thank you very much. I want to clear one thing out. Actually, Danny Lutz was the guy who got all of this started. I was kind of sitting back and not getting involved. So Danny got this whole series started, and I started working with him. And so he's is more responsible for this than anyone. I want to give a shout out to Mary Hott, who we've invited. She was on Mountain Stage last fall with the Carpenter Ants. We asked her to perform at one of our events. I'll talk about that in just a second. And she's just been a force of nature. She's got in there and she's done all the heavy lifting and all that. So I really want to give a shout out to her. And one other person I like to recognize is Dave Corbin, author Dave Corbin, who wrote Life, Work, and Rebellion. He really wanted to be here tonight, but he wasn't unable to. So I do want to recognize those three folks. As Dr. Sherwood said, this is the second of 4 or 5 events that we have going on. This coming Friday, next Friday, the 6th, at Reynolds Hall here in Shepherd, we'll be showing the documentary Mine Wars American Experience documentary. So that's at 7 o'clock on May 13th, Friday, May 13th. We're kind of having our finale. From Wes Harris and his Traveling Mine War Museum will be at the Old Opera House from 1 o'clock till the show, which will be at 7:30. I'll talk about that. Wes was friends with William C. Blizzard. Bill Blizzard's son, Bill Blizzard, was tried for treason in Charlestown. And he has a lot of family history, artifacts from the period of the treason trials and all that. So he'll be there at the Old Opera House from 5 to 7. We'll have the courtroom in the old Jefferson County courthouse open from 5 to 7. This is the courtroom where the treason trials took place. And it's pretty much the same as it was back in 1922. So that's from 5 to 7. And then at 7:30, we're going to have a concert for workers' rights, basically in commemoration of the treason trials and the miners and the laborers. That's from 7:30 till whenever the show's over. And again, that will be Mary Hott and the Carpenter Ants, and also Tom Writing from Pittsburgh. He is a labor musician. He works a lot with the UMWA, and he's got a couple of good albums and some really touching songs on a lot of these events.
And it's a bargain. I just bought tickets, $10.
$10, and proceeds go to the Old Opera House. So we hope you come out for that. Bring your friends. We do want to thank our sponsors who are helping us to put on all these events. The United Mine Workers of America, the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum in Matewan, Shepherd University Center for Appalachian Studies and Communities, the Jefferson County Convention and Visitors Bureau, and Coal Country Tours. And we still have slots for anybody who wants to sponsor. So if you have an employer or someone that you think might be interested, have them check us out. We do have a Facebook page, and that's Treason Trial Centennial. Is that right, Mary?
West Virginia Treason Trials 100.
West Virginia Treason Trials 100.
Treason Trials, you'll find it.
Okay. And with that, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Cecilia.
Hello. So basically, I have some questions that each person submitted, and we'll go through some of those. And then the chat is up. So if somebody on Zoom wants to ask a question, I'll monitor that. And also anybody in the audience, I guess raise your hand if you want to ask a question. But let's hear from each of the speakers first, and we're going to start with Chuck Keeney and kind of have him set the scene about the history of the trials in Charlestown and why they were even here, because we have no coal mines.
Well, that's precisely the reason why the trials were here, or why they moved here. Of course, as many of you already know, I assume that a lot of people here and the people that are watching are familiar a little bit with the major story that involves with the West Virginia Mine Wars. Of course, Battle of Blair Mountain, which took place in August and the first couple of days of September 1921. After that, you had several hundred miners that were arrested, including the Union leadership, which surrendered later. That included my great-grandfather, Bill Blizzard, and Mooney and Bill Petrie, the vice president. And many of them stayed in the Logan County Jail for about a little over 100 days, as where many of them were. And the treatment in Logan County, shall we say, was not conducive to a fair trial. The situation was Don Chafin, the sheriff of Logan, charged locals 25 cents if you wanted to go up and heckle the miners while they were behind bars. With that, and some other incidents that happened, the defense lawyer, T.C. Townsend, who was the lead defense lawyer, he was able to secure a change of venue to Jefferson County, of course, and where presumably they would be able to get away from all of the corruption and the influences and everything that might hinder a fair trial. And so the trials get moved here. The trials are going to go on until 1924, the spring of 1924, and they're going to change venues 2 more times, once to Morgan County and then again to Fayette County. So they drag on for quite a while. But a lot of times the treason trials are just thought of as an aftermath to the Battle of Blair Mountain. And hopefully by the end of this discussion, we can add a little bit more to that. It's much more than an aftermath, but it's also something on one hand that sets the stage for the conflicts that are to come in the coal industry and in organized labor. But in addition to that, I think it's also important to understand the enormous history of significant legal battles there have been throughout the history of West Virginia over coal extraction industry. Because after all of these major events that take place, everything from Blair Mountain to Buffalo Creek to Upper Big Branch to even the 2 different court cases involved over the Blair Mountain battlefield, and tons of litigation surrounding coal. And a lot of the battles over West Virginia have taken place in the courtroom. And we need to kind of look at the treason trials in the context of that. So hopefully that sets the stage a little bit. And I'll try not to lecture.
Maybe Doug could set more of the stage, because once the trials came here, it was something different for folks in Jefferson County, right, Doug?
Yeah, I think it was something, it was a huge event, first of all. It was kind of the trial of the century. There were newspapers came from all over the country to cover this. And in the summer or spring of 1922, the name that you saw was Blizzard, Bill Blizzard, Bill Blizzard. But I think in the Jefferson County courthouse, they set up a table with like 10 new phone lines just for the dispatches, because of all the newspapers that were coming. New York Times, the San Francisco papers, a lot of them out of the coal country up in Pennsylvania, places like that. But it was a nationwide story. Because it was a big story. World War II had ended, or World War I, excuse me, it had ended just a couple of years before, and you had this period where there was a lot of labor unrest, and then it was just before the crackdown, the Red Scare and all that, so this was a huge deal. And it was something exciting for this area. It was an agrarian area. Things like this didn't just happen, but treason trials in themselves are exceedingly rare. And the fact that, after 50 odd years after John Brown had been tried, that another treason trial or set of treason trials would take place in Jefferson County. As far as the trials go, you can't talk about the trials without talking about Bill Blizzard. Bill Blizzard was the first to be tried. And like I say, his name was on the headlines across the country in the spring of 1922. Bill Blizzard was a sub-district 2 president of the UMWA of the District 17. I believe his territory was south of Charleston, and it would have included Vigo and Logan County had they managed to organize those. But when you look at Bill Blizzard's life, he's a character, and it's almost inevitable that he would end up in Charlestown charged with treason, his neck on the line, because that's just kind of the story of Bill Blizzard. His mom and dad were both Union supporters and organizers. They were living down in the living and working in the New River Fields in 1902 when they had a big strike there. That strike eventually failed, and as a result of that, Tim was blacklisted. They were evicted from their home and basically chased out of the territory with anyone else who had supported the Union. So a lot of those folks ended up drifting up the C&O to the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek area, which was a new coal field that was opened up. And Bill's mom, Sarah, who was the real Union advocate in the family, we both were, but she was just really something else. She was a force. And you can imagine he was very much pro-Union because of who his parents were. And during that strike, which turned out to be one of the bloodiest and longest labor strikes in American history, up to that point, young Bill was right in the middle of it. He saw his mom set up a kitchen in her house to feed starving miners. They let miners pitch tents on their land because they'd all been evicted from the coal company towns, things like that. So that was a vicious, vicious strike, and it radicalized a lot of people who went through it. And you can imagine what it did to a young boy like that. But Bill didn't kind of go over the edge. He basically, it radicalized him, but he basically put his focus on the Union. So he rose up through the ranks, and by 1921, when the Battle of Blair Mountain took place, he was a sub-district president. Like I say, he was a character. Fred Mooney basically said that he was a bull in a china shop. He acted without any regard to consequences, and you see that throughout his life. It's just in his character. His son William, who I got to know before he passed away here a few years ago, he was actually at the Charlestown treason trials. I think he was 6, 7, 8 years old at the time. We have photos of him, but he passed away at 93, and he said his dad would fight you at the drop of a hat, and he'd drop the hat for you. That's the kind of guy he was. So that was Bill Blizzard. So when the march started on Blair Mountain, Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney basically had to skedaddle. They had to do that for a couple of reasons. Main reason was they had to protect the Union. They were the force behind what was going on. They were the leadership. That was the president, secretary, treasurer, and those guys that worked together for years and years. And so they were the force behind what was going on. But when the march got going, they had to separate themselves from the Union for legal reasons, because if they knew this was going to be big, and we see where it ended. It ended up with treason trials. So they had to protect the Union by getting away. So they went off to Ohio to sit out the main part of the march. That was part of it. And the other part was some of the miners had become really radicalized. And when they tried to stop the march, they were told basically, if you interfere, it's not going to turn out well for you. So at that point, you have all these guys marching on Blair Mountain, and you needed a leader. You needed someone on the ground, head of the front rank and file. Well, that's Bill Blizzard. That's his dream. He jumped in both feet first. He had a wife and a young son, and he didn't think about the consequences. He went in there and kind of led the army south. So I think in a lot of ways, he was the man of the hour. He was the man that they needed. And he took risks that no one else could or would. And so the problem was, after it all worked itself out, after the Uncle Sam sent in federal troops, the miners refused to fight against the Uncle Sam. They were fighting against state officials. He kind of took the blame, or he was the first to be focused on, because the coal operators felt they had the strongest case against him. They had no case against Keeney and Mooney. They couldn't really tie them to this march because Keeney had said, "I wash my hands of the whole thing." Shortly before he left, he said that, "I have no control over these guys at this point anymore." So Bill was brought to Charlestown, again, just a real character. Whether or not he would be convicted, I think it was a long shot. Judge Hammer will talk about the legal aspects more, but it was the hope of the coal companies that they could convict him because they would smear the union at the same time, and Bill could have paid dearly for that. But if you look at what has been written about the trials, or if you go back and look at the papers, Bill Blizzard's kind of the focus, and that's kind of the human face, I think, more so than the legal aspects or the political aspects or all of that. So that's mostly why I want to just talk a little bit about Bill, because the recent trials was Bill Blizzard.
Now, you just mentioned Judge Hammer. Basically, you've done a lot of research into what actually happened and to the three men who were tried here. Go ahead and kind of talk a little bit about that.
Well, okay, I want to set the stage a little bit more, understand the context of this, because, you know, coal mining in West Virginia was quite active. It was a major employer in the South of the state. And as we cross into the 20th century and up through the 1920s, you'll see that more than 2,000 miners per year are dying of industrial accidents. You know, we had Upper Big Branch a few years back, and some other mine disasters, and we wept for the miners that were killed there. But now we're talking thousands each year. We're also in an era before workers' compensation, so that if you were to be injured in the mine, you would be tossed away like a broken piece of equipment. There was no money for your family, no money for your kids, nothing. You lived in a company town. Some of you may say, oh, I lived in the dorms. It's kind of like that, right? Not exactly. You weren't paid with US currency. You were paid with script. And the company controlled the script and required that you purchase your own equipment. So your own shovels, your own picks. And that script was worthless, because if you went to another operator or some other part of the state, the script had no value. So you're essentially locked in. You're locked into a dangerous job that at the time in 1922 was paying about on average $700 a year for a non-union miner. And I went back in preparation for today and looked at what $700 is worth. And today's dollars, that'd be about $15,000 a year. So think of that, to live on $15,000 a year today and to work a job that could get you killed or seriously injured in a heartbeat. It was a real crisis. Now, the unions, of course, at the time, had a great number of issues they were concerned with. Obviously concerned with wages, concerned with child labor, concerned with number of hours of work per week, concerned generally with safety in the coal mines. And so tensions began to boil as the union spread, I think, from Ohio and UMW, I think it was Ohio and Kentucky, I think it spread over here. Is that right? Yeah. And the mining companies themselves were, of course, very, very concerned that they would lose control of the mines and be forced to pay miners more money. And indeed, they wanted a competitive advantage against those fields that were organized so they could continue to sell their coal in what post-World War I were slowly depressive conditions for the price of coal. So they were actively against having any union influence in their mines. Logan County was kind of battleground. Logan County had many, many mine operations. In fact, when we get to the Jefferson County case, I counted up to see how many mine companies were involved. And we had 77 mine companies involved from Logan and Kanawha County, to give you an idea. Now, as we talk about the union side, let me say this about the miner side, not about the mine operator side. They were actively against unions. And they had their association of mine companies that hired attorneys and litigated cases so that they could stop the miners from coming in. And this is where I want to just think about that for a moment. So they form an association, which might be another word for a union. They form a union of coal operators to stop a union of employees. And why was that? How did they do that? Well, they entered into what are called yellow dog contracts. So a yellow dog contract is a contract by which the lawyers for the miner operators presented to an employee and said, if you want to maintain your job or you want to get a job, you need to sign this contract that says you are not now a member of a union, that you will never be a member of a union. And it's election season, so I don't know if any of you are running for office or here right now, but we always hear discussion in election season about my favorite constitutional rights. And so you'll hear people say, I love the First Amendment. First Amendment's your right of association. And other people say, I love the Second Amendment. But what you almost never hear people say is, I love the Fifth Amendment, due process guarantee. Or I love the Seventh Amendment, the right to a jury trial. Because without those two rights, all of your other rights within the Constitution are essentially worthless. So they sign these yellow dog contracts, and the US Supreme Court and other federal courts and state courts uphold those contracts because they say, just as a man has a right to associate and join the union, so too does the employer have the right to say, you can't belong to him. And so in a case, put it down. In a case called Hitchman, Cole, and Koch versus Mitchell, it's a 1917 case. In that case, UMWA was trying to speak to miners who had already signed these contracts and trying to get them to join the union in Logan County. And in miner, companies would go to federal court or sometimes state court, but often federal court and get an injunction and to stop the UMWA from speaking to the miners who signed this contract. So we do have federal action, injunction after injunction. Now I'm going to jump ahead for just a moment and talk about the Norris-LaGuardia Act, which is the act that said we can't go to federal court and enjoin activity of exercising your right to join a union. So the Norris-LaGuardia Act said we have to stop that, but it did not stop the use of yellow dog contracts because the company and the employee could still enter into that contract. It's just we're no longer going to enjoin the miners from seeking to organize those employees. That didn't change until 1932 when we have passage of the National Labor Relations Act. But in case you think yellow dog contracts are a thing of the past, I'm just going to throw out a thought to you. How many of you have clicked on a software app and not read the 20 pages of text, which happen to mention that if you have any dispute, you have waived your Seventh Amendment right to a jury trial, and instead you've agreed to binding arbitration? Or how many of you have signed a commercial contract when you buy some product and it has fine print on the back, which you never read, and it says you agree by purchasing this product that you will not organize into a class action. In other words, you won't associate with other people to protect your rights. And that's a descendant of the yellow dog contracts that we still argue about today. I've gone on and on.
Yeah, this might be a good time for Denise to talk a little bit, because he's talking about events that happened, and you want to put in context sort of a little history of West Virginia and the way the mines formed here.
Yeah, can you hear me again? Yeah, I felt when I agreed to be on this panel, I felt like a little bit of an outlier because I really didn't research when I was doing a whole bunch of research for Stormy Hill, I didn't really research the treason trials because I had a character who admit Rondell Lloyd, who's sort of a fictional version of possibly Bill Blair's and some others, and but also not an imagination. And then at the end of the Battle of Blair Mountain, he got shot and they took him off to Kentucky and he died. And so like I stopped researching. so everything that happened after he died, I just don't know much about. So part of this is getting an education for me as well about the treason trials. But I was thinking I really want to focus my remarks on what I was trying to do with Storming Heaven and the Unquiet Earth all along, which is to show the connection with the rest of the country and also with what's going on today. I think one of the myths of Appalachia is that Appalachia is isolated and has never been somehow impacted by the rest of the country, and that's just a myth. And if you look at the mine wars, you see that clearly. And I think the fact that we're sitting here in Jefferson County, West Virginia, where there's no coal, if you look at all the way back to when all this started, it starts with an area of West Virginia where there's small subsistence farmers. And you have a judge in Parkersburg where there is also no coal, Judge Jackson, who's a relative of Stonewall, who ruled in case after case that land companies and railroad companies and coal companies could come in and take land that was owned by farmers, even though they had a deed. Judge Jackson ruled that the companies had previous deeds, which somehow materialized mysteriously from the Revolutionary War. And so all of a sudden, and I've done research on land ownership in McDowell County, this is true of other counties as well. Over about a 5-year period, if you look at the land books in McDowell County, say in 1875, you see a list of a bunch of farmers' names, local names. And if you look at 1890, you see a bunch of company names. And it turned over that fast. And people were disenfranchised and just kicked off their land, basically. And so that was a national thing. It started as also being supported by national media who fed the country lurid stories about those crazy hillbillies and how they were all shooting each other and they belonged to some primitive species. I've even seen articles in the New York Times that talk about mountain people as species, lesser species. And so that was a justification. It was very similar to what was done with Native Americans to say, well, they're not doing anything with that land. They're just a bunch of lazy hillbillies. So we need to bring industry in here and make that land productive. So that was a national effort that continued through what all these gentlemen have been talking about the development of the coal industry. You can see the straight line through all the different parts of the mine wars, whether it's Cabin Creek, Paint Creek, the mine wars of the 1920 and 1921 Blair Mountain, and what came after that, when step on to World War II, when John L. Lewis led a strike in the middle of a war, which was really criticized, as you can imagine, but it was desperately needed by coal miners who were dying at a rate as great or greater than the soldiers on the battlefield, and continued on through all the tribulations and travails of the Union through the 1960s and 1970s. And all this while you have national either making fun of or ignoring in terms of the national media. You have federal government looking the other way. You have state government looking the other way. You have congressional delegation, bring it up to 2022, that has blocked black loan legislation for minors. And so let's bring it up to last night where we had Alex Mooney and Lauren Boebert rallying in Kearneysville last night. Federal, nowhere to be seen except for that. State, nowhere to be seen except for Jim Justice and Baby Dogs giveaways. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's a line that starts with the mine wars, that goes in before the mine wars, continues on. McDowell County is still absentee owned. Miners are still suffering, and our political system, with the consent of the federal government, is still continues to be corrupt. So that's where that's what I have to contribute, I guess, is to bring it into this larger picture.
Well, rather than me asking all the questions, I want to take a minute and see if anyone in the audience wants to ask a question or make a comment or add anything to the discussion. Yes.
Back in those days, in the 1920s, were there any coal mine owners who might be the equivalent of a Jeff Bezos today, the super rich, or were they all sort of more individual coal miners who are not individual coal owners who were obviously wealthy?
Not at all, not at all. Small operators. There were some, but many of them were different coal companies set up by a parent corporation that created lots of little corporations. And that practice had certain financial advantages, employment advantages, bankruptcy advantages. And so it was common. Of the 77 I've counted up, many of them were under a parent corporation called Guyan Corporation. And even at that Guyan Corporation, it was a member of the Bituminous Coal Operators Association, which then was the group of groupings of coal operators. So when the miners were seeking to negotiate, they were really seeking to have some equal power at the negotiating table. Because it's one thing as an individual to go and say, hey, I'd like shorter work hours, I'd like safer conditions, I'd like better pay. You're not going to get too far. You'll probably be told, take your script and leave.
Dan?
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about the scene in Jefferson County during the trials. You mentioned Logan County, the scene there. What was it like in Jefferson County? Can you paint a picture for us?
Couple things. Also, Justice Collins was a very prominent coal operator in the state. Was probably the most famous, but a lot of those coal companies also were subsidiaries. U.S. Steel owned a lot of coal companies, a lot of railroad companies. Cobbles P. Huntington was one of the wealthiest railroad Mongols in the whole country. Founded the city of Huntington. He owned a lot. But anyway, seen in Jefferson County. Okay, so they begin to bombard Jefferson County with propaganda and other means and ways to try to persuade potential jurors before the trials began. As soon as they secured a change of venue, they began trying to, both sides did. And they use a lot of interesting little tactics. For example, the Union sent organizers into Jefferson County posing as Bible salesmen. And they would go from house to house selling Bibles. And they'd say, oh, we just came from Logan County. And you wouldn't believe how awful things are in Logan County. You wouldn't believe there's this Chafin guy down there, and he just treats miners horribly. You know, they just, tell all these stories about Logan County and all this to try to do it. Meanwhile, the coal operators hired, and I forget his name is escaped me. I was looking through my notes trying to find his name. They brought in at the time, I forget, he was the most popular evangelical preacher in America. Yes, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, Billy Sunday. Yeah, they brought him in to the state to give a series of talks of taking the coal operator side, saying that the individuals that were involved, in the Battle of Bear Mountain, that was unchristian. They were that was not what a good Christian does. These people, he used the term human buzzards to describe the miners that were involved. In addition to this, there were enormous attempts to bribe people, potential jurors. The coal miners' wives all went out in front of the courthouse every morning before the proceedings started, and they sang gospel songs to try to, get public opinion a little more. There was the battle in the courtroom, and there was the battle for the court of public opinion going on simultaneously. So a lot of little interesting things. And then, of course, things get a little bit deadly. There were 2 miners that turned state's evidence and testified against Walter Allen, and they were set to testify against Frank Keeney, Ed Reynolds, and J.W. Swanner. They testified against Walter Allen in his trial. He was convicted of treason, but both of them were murdered afterwards. So they didn't make it very long. After that, so there was a lot of that. It was a really intense situation going on here, and of course, the operators were smelling blood in the water because they see an opportunity to destroy the UMWA as a legal entity because they can say it's an insurrectionist organization, and if they can do that, then that paves the way for them to go after all of these other unions. They can go after organized labor, as a whole legally if they can, win this case. They even started up an organization meant to not just build up propaganda in their favor, but also to control school curriculum so that something like Blair Mountain would never happen again. It's called the American Constitutional Association that they have founded. Phil Conley, who started up the Golden Horseshoe competition, by the way. And he also wrote the textbooks that were used in West Virginia schools up until through the 1960s. And they took everything out. The big reason was this was a reaction, of course, to Blair Mountain, and then trying to be able to control the narrative. A lot of what was going on around here was about controlling the narrative. But the coal miners and the union, they were successful in winning a lot of people over. They had a baseball game. The judge allowed them to have a baseball game here. I don't know if you have any photographs of that over at the courthouse, but they had a baseball game out there. There's a photograph we have at the Mine Wars Museum. Bill Blizzard playing in that baseball game. So they were able to slowly win over public opinion, but it was certainly a circus here in this town.
To give you an idea, there was a marching band at the ready when Bill Blizzard was acquitted. So they had a band go right down the street.
The coal companies kind of overplayed their hand too. They had sent their own agents out to, I think they were Singer sewing machines. You get a great deal on a new sewing machine, but they say, I was just down in southern West Virginia. And those miners are animals, they're just, and they really played this up that they were dangerous people, kind of the hillbilly, stigma again. They really pushed that. And then when the miners showed up in Charlestown, they were like everybody else. Had a little bit of a twang, but they dressed nice. The mine workers union made sure everyone went to church on Sunday and were well behaved and all that. And they really did win over the local populace. When the first train came in, this shocked the town. They brought in the first 12 miners that they put in the jail, and they stopped at the train station on the west end of Charlestown, and they had these 11, 12 guys shackled together, and they were rags because they just come out of Logan County Jail and shackled together. There was a black man amongst them, and that kind of shocked the southern sensibilities here, but they marched them right down through town, and the locals were just appalled. They couldn't believe this, that they were treating people this way. So when the miners train showed up a couple days later, there were several hundred miners and their witnesses and attorneys and all that. They actually had kind of an impromptu parade through town, and they went to Charles Washington Hall, and they went upstairs, and some of the local fraternal organizations met them there, and they had offered them a certificate to the city of friendship and all this, and offered to put the miners up in people's homes. So the miners really did win the public opinion battle initially. It seemed to have changed some after Bill Blizzard was acquitted and the trials dragged on and dragged on and dragged on, and people kind of went from being this big exciting thing to kind of a burden on the county. But the coal companies overplayed their hands, and so the miners did win initially, I think, in that aspect.
I think you're kind of too describing, and I know I've talked to you Doug about this, the cultural difference between folks from, we talk about it all the time now, right? Folks from other part of the state can be culturally different from folks here. So talk a little bit about that the people here are different.
Yeah, when I do my tours or when I talk to groups, I kind of touch on this sometimes. For folks in this part of the state, Eastern Panhandle, West Virginia is kind of like West Virginia to people from other states. It's kind of over there. Those are different people there. It's a whole different culture in Southern West Virginia. And the point I try to make is there's a direct correlation to what happens here as what happens in Southern West Virginia. When you look at the political corruption and environmental degradation and the drug, plague that's rocked the southern part of the state, all of those things, that costs the state money, and that costs the state lost revenue that could be, if it was a productive part of the state with jobs and industry and things like that, it could help carry the burden. But what happens is all the money that's spent dealing with those problems is less money that's going to schools and roads and the infrastructure, the things that you need. And so I try to tell folks that, it's different, but we're all, part of the same.
Yeah.
We're all in this together, as they said in Meet One. We're all in this together. So don't think of the rest of the state as And again, that goes back to the hillbilly stigma. I'm sure everyone's heard of the Hatfields and McCoys. On some of my tours, I'll ask people, what do you know about that? And then, well, it was a fight over a pig. It was a fight over a romance. That was the first shot of the mine wars. That's what the Hatfield and McCoys was about, because it was about who's going to control the resources, who is going to benefit from the resources, the extraction of timber and coal and all this, and the land issue comes in because, again, they came in and they took all the value, all the land, all the mineral rights, they took it from those people. So this whole history, as Denise said, there's a straight line from what happened in 1902, 1912, 1913, 1921. There's a straight line to our current history. And so I try to encourage people to look at it that way, that, you know, it may seem a little bit foreign, may seem different, but we're all part of the same ecosystem. So we have to think of it that way. We need to worry about what's happening.
And again, the national press really, during the Hatfield McCoys feud, there were a couple of incidents between the Hatfields and McCoys, and it kind of died down then. And meanwhile, the national press had gotten a hold of it, and they're spreading the story nationwide that all kinds of crazy stuff was going on, to the point where at one point the governor of West Virginia and the governor of Kentucky called out the National Guard and were sending them to Mingo County and Pike County. And they found that there was nothing going on. And they came back and said, there's nothing going on. You know, they're just reading the New York Times about this crazy stuff going on, and it's not. You know, so it's part of a national, and our modern version is Hillbilly Elegy, but it's a national attempt to talk about a culture that's totally scam, basically.
And there was a reason for that too. Again, that was when you say these people are inbred hillbillies, they're drunkards, they're lazy, then we're going to come in here and change that. We're going to give them jobs. We're going to,
Bring progress.
Exactly, progress. And that's where it all started. That's where the hillbilly image really started. What you had was officials in Pike County were using that story to denigrate the Hatfields in West Virginia. The Hatfields were actually the political elite of Logan County. They were the judges and the constables and people like that. But because there were no cities other than Logan, which was the next valley over, unlike the political elite in most counties, they didn't live in fine clapboard houses. They lived in log cabins, things like that, and had long beards. So the folks in Pike County tried to use that stereotype, try to pin it on the Hatfields, and the press ran with it because it sold newspapers. And the coal companies and the land companies, they fell right in and just pushed that too, because see, that's why we got to be in here. That's why we need to take control of the land. We need to bring in progress, as Chuck said.
Yeah, the town of Maitland sits on the property that Deadlands Hatfield used to own. So it's right there. Eskdale that you mentioned earlier, that was Keeney family land before. So yeah, it's right there. In the land.
And one of my great grandfathers had land in Pike County, Kentucky, and he was a rounder, my mom would say. He would go out Saturday night drinking and carousing, and so he ended up in jail. And for bail, they let him sign away some land, which he didn't know. They didn't want to tell him what he was doing. They just said, sign this and we'll let you out. And he did, and my family lost acreage in Pike County, Kentucky. And there were families that we knew that were school teachers that had their land taken with X's because they couldn't sign their names. Well, they were school teachers. So we're not talking about people down there who are hillbillies and bad. We're talking about my family.
Sylvia? So tell us what happened at the end of the trials. I want to know about that. I want to know what happened to Bill Blizzard. What happened really to to Frank Keeney and Mooney? What happened to these people after the trials?
Well, I can address that from a legal perspective. From a legal perspective, the county had become so polarized. And I have dozens of affidavits from citizens of the county making all sorts of allegations about strong feelings, bribery, corruption, everything you can imagine going on. The county itself was nearly bankrupted by the cost of hosting these trials. because they had to bring on extra deputies, bailiffs, all the expenses of the trial. UMWA was nearly bankrupted because of the trials. You know, they were paying some amount of wages, some portion of the wages of the miners who weren't working. But because all the witnesses were in Logan County, the companies had the assets to bring the witnesses up here by train and to put them up in hotels, perhaps pay them for their testimony, and to hire 4 lawyers who actually prosecuted the case, not really the county prosecutor. So that it was a hard financial hit to the county. And so eventually, Chuck's great-grandfather filed a motion to change the venue a second time. Now, the Jefferson County prosecutor actually opposed that motion, but I think the court Judge Bond probably looked at that and said, well, the county is so polarized. It's doubtful at this point that a fair trial can be held. And so they negotiated on where it should go next. And the thought was that, well, move it over to Morton County and you can do some of the trials over there. And then eventually, I think probably Chuck might know more about this. Eventually, the cost was high there, and they moved some down to Fayette County, which kind of brings us back to an issue that Danny Lutz raised with me. And his cause of 4-year search is that we are still searching for the transcript of the Frank Blizzard trial. It's not known to exist. I have 1 page of it, a photocopy of Major Short's testimony, who established that Bill Blizzard was running the operation. When he asked people to put down their weapons, they did. So that was key evidence in his treason trial. But we haven't located the transcript yet. We have a receipt for Fayette County, where Greenbrier, where for several dollars, the transcript was apparently sent there. Danny tells me that a young J. Edgar Hoover was present at the Jefferson County Courthouse with 2 FBI, predecessor to the FBI, 2 transcriptionists. And I think we're going to write to the FBI and see if
It was Bureau of Investigation.
Bureau of Investigations at the time. And we're going to write to see, maybe by chance,
It's not in archives either.
it's not archives. So
Most likely it is in the coal operators' offices in Charleston. Because they never answered my inquiries.
we would love to have that transcript. There's several documents in Jefferson
in
County
fact,
missing.
Other than the Major Smart's testimony, the only parts of that transcript that exist is the indictment and a few pages of instructions to the jury, and they're in microfiche in the Colston collection at WVU.
I actually have them now.
Well, you have them in your office too.
Yes. So I have the handwritten verdict where they found Bill Blizzard not guilty. And I have other documents from the case as well, including a whole bunch of documents involving Chuck's great-grandfather.
One curiosity is, I'll ask this and then you can, Bill Blizzard got found not guilty. Why do you think?
Well, of course, we don't have the transcript, so that's a hard thing to answer. I will say that to be found guilty of treason requires that you be found guilty of making war against the state or aiding the state's enemies. It has to be attested to by 2 sworn witnesses. Of course, a lot was on the line for Bill Blizzard. Penalty at that time was 3 possible penalties: death, 3 to 15 years, I believe, or forfeiture of all your property. So a great deal was on the line for him. Not to mention, he had been subjected to bail at that time of $20,000, which in modern dollars is about $325,000. So the way bail works is you usually have to put down 10% of it as a fee to the bail bondsman. So I imagine the UMWA had to dig deep to get these miners out of jail in Logan County and get them up here.
We have a question in the back of the room.
Actually, Judge Hammer sort of just answered. I wanted to understand what the exact definition of treason was. And you're saying it was against a government, either the state or the feds.
That's right.
So how are there, I mean, because these wars were against the they were against the mine owner. How did it become something against the feds? And something
Well,
against
so
the state?
Don Chapin, sheriff of Logan County, he and his deputies were on the coal operator's payroll. And so in 1920 and 1921, that period of time, more than $100,000. So again, think about what that is today. That's about 16 times that value. That's what is in current dollars. Was paid to Don Chafin and his deputies to maintain order and control for the benefit of the coal operators.
My observation in the research I did was that there is no, the state and the coal companies are like this, there's no dividing line. So if you have martial law, for example, declared by the governor of West Virginia, enforced by later the state police, they were just coming into existence. And before that, Baldwin Belts Detective Agency, which is a private agency. There's no, you cannot tease them apart. It's like a whole cloth.
State police did fight at Blair Mountain. They had Tommy guns. They used Tommy guns at Blair Mountain. We've got the bullets to prove it. At the Mine Wars Museum. You asked a question about what happened after the trial. What happened to everyone after that? Just to try to give you a brief synopsis here. Okay, so for the Union, first of all, the 1920s were really, really tough times. In the 1920s saw the highest rate of mining deaths and accidents in West Virginia history. That decade after Blair Mountain saw the highest rate. After that, in addition, everybody had to sign yellow dog contracts that they were able to secure injunctions against the Union all across the state. When the treason trials ended, treason trials in a broader sense, all of the trials ended in 1924. At that moment, there were about 50,000 UMWA coal miners in the state. Within 5 years, there were less than 1,000 dues-paying members. Within 2 weeks of Frank Keeney being found not guilty of murder, he and Mooney were called to Illinois to meet with John L. Lewis, where he forced them to resign from the Union. He blamed them for the armed march on Logan. So they tried to shoot the Union into the state, forced them to resign. He also forces Blizzard out, although Blizzard would come back into the UMWA in the 1930s. Blizzard would later be appointed the head of District 17. He was appointed, not elected. Frank Keeney was the last person that was elected as a district president for 50 years until the Miners for Democracy movement that was led by Richard Trumka and Cecil Roberts and some of the others in the 70s. So he was the last district president elected for 50 years. Keeney himself went through several jobs, but then he started his own union when he started the West Virginia Mine Workers Union in 1930 and got 23,000 miners to join his union when there were less than 1,000 in the WA. And that union lasted for 3 years. He led 4 hunger marches during the Great Depression into Charleston and started up his own political party, the West Virginia Labor Party, but it never made it past the 32 election.
When I was researching the Empire, my next book, I read a book called American Jitters by Edmund Wilson, who was one of the most famous writers of the 1930s and 40s. And he writes about Frank Keeney. He writes after Frank Keeney started his own union, and he has this really vivid picture of him driving through a coal camp and little kids running behind the car, going, Frank Keeney, Frank Keeney. Yeah, it's really a vivid, very vivid picture. It's a book. It's a long forgotten book that's well worth looking at. The Resurrection.
Yeah.
Can any of you tie what you're talking about to what West Virginia is like today? What the contribution to the way our state is today?
I feel like I've done too much of the talking. You don't want to, I mean, I'll talk about it, but I mean, people have a chance to. What does it mean? Do you mean just the treason trials in and of itself?
The
or-
treason trials were part of what you just talked about,
Right.
which is the the unions and the coal mines and the back and forth. How did all this contribute to the West Virginia we know today?
Yeah, and several factors. First of all, is people have been talking about the stereotype remains perpetuated of West Virginians of having this hillbilly persona, the redneck. Of course, the miners were wearing red bandanas around their necks. The term redneck meant something very different in 1921 and 22 than what it means today. It meant you were pro-union, and now it's a joke, right? It's a running joke. Until the word redneck 100 years ago, it meant something entirely different. And the train that they took up here that you were talking about, they called it the Red Special. But so it has helped shape national, and sometimes even international perception of this region. We've never been able to really shake that stigma because of that. But additionally, the power structure didn't change. What happened at Blair Mountain? The miners didn't win at Blair Mountain, right? They didn't win. And they went through 10 really rough years. And if you read a lot of the histories of the mine wars, what you'll find is you get to Blair Mountain and then you get a couple of pages on the treason trials, and then they skip to 1932 and Roosevelt, yay, everything's okay. That we were allowed to unionize, and then just kind of skips this whole huge tumultuous decade. But Blair Mountain and the treason trials, it kept the power structure, the political power structure intact. And by that I meant, as Denise said, the industry and the politics were one and the same. And our governor is a coal operator, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, our governor is a coal operator. Yes, yes, and our senior senator makes a lot of money off of the coal industry. So it still pulls the strings of what happens, and it's because of the coal industry's influence that, Joe Manchin is the way he is, and Joe Manchin was able to, to hold back the Build Back Better Act and a number of things. So the consequences, the ripple effects of the power structure that exists in a place like this and how that can impact things a century later, we're still seeing that in a variety of different ways. But we're also seeing other things. In 2018, when the teachers went on strike, if you saw images from that, what were they wearing? They were wearing red bandanas. And why were they wearing red bandanas? They were wearing red bandanas because it harkened back to this book called 55 Strong about the West Virginia teacher strike and how that started up a strike wave that has continued in the United States to this day. Amazon workers, Starbucks workers going on strike, all of these, this reinvigorated labor movement that's taken place. It started here in West Virginia. And that's a kind of always talk about the red bandana as a scarlet red throughout West Virginia history. And by the fact, the first documented case of the red bandana was not a coal miner, but actually railroad workers in the 1877 railroad strike, just over here in Martinsburg. So one of the other continuity, other than the power structure, is that the cornerstone of the labor movement in America has continuously been West Virginia. And it continues to be so. And the teachers in 2018 in West Virginia spoke very eloquently about their parents, grandparents that were involved on the picket lines and the strikes. They remembered Blair Mountain. They remembered the mine wars, and that legacy carried with it. So it carries in a variety of ways.
We have a question here.
Yeah, given the labor history you just described and its continuity in threads of it, the continuity that we see today, what is it about perhaps the earlier wars, et cetera, that might have some predictive value in understanding how we've moved from being a blue democratic labor political stronghold to the Republican stronghold that the state is now? Is that, do you think, from really different elements, or are there similar cultural themes that are now shaping the politics differently? What's your understanding of that?
I think some of it is media. Actually, media. And I look at two figures. I look at one is not a media person, Don Blankenship, the other is Rupert Murdoch. But the story I like to tell to answer that question, because I get that question a lot. And I think probably a lot of West Virginians do who are old enough to have seen the flip from blue to red. I used to work for Ken Heckler back in the early 80s, and we had a hearing in Gilbert, West Virginia, in Neego County. It was about local election corruption. And we had to send a team down there to investigate and talk to people. So we're sitting there in Gilbert all day, and during a break, I was sitting there next to a gentleman who looked like the typical, what we're talking about, the typical stereotype. He was probably about 80 years old. He had on overalls, plaid shirt, and we were talking, and he said, and this is 1982. If you remember what's going on in the world events, he said, "You've been reading about that there Nelson Mandela, the way they're treating him over in South Africa. That's just horrible. They got him in jail, and they're doing this to him and that to him, and it's just." And I knew the name Nelson Mandela, and I knew he was in jail, but that's about all I knew, to be honest. He's telling me all this stuff, and I said, "Where did you get that?" He said, "The UMWA Journal." Now, that's 1983, I think, 283. Now that man would be watching Fox News, and he wouldn't be getting the UMWA Journal. His kids wouldn't be getting the UMWA Journal. He'd be getting Fox News, and it would be and YouTube, and that's where his information would come from. And that's why, that's one reason I think we have flipped.
But just to follow up, what is the draw of Fox News to people who had historically the kind of perspective that you've just been describing, and the labor interest and the focus on what would be classic democratic politics? Why would they be drawn now to Fox News rather than MSNBC, or some other media outlet?
Let me just push back for a moment on the party labels, because party labels are extraordinarily confusing. That shows you this. So the Norris-LaGuardia Act was the act that said federal courts can't join this, passed by a Republican Congress. National Labor Relations Act, passed by Republicans, not by the Democrats. So when you start putting the party label on, I don't really think trying to understand where we are then and now really follows a straight line with party labels. I think really what you're talking about are changing attitudes and which has the upper hand at any given time. But the parties have reversed positions on any number of issues.
Yes.
And someone on Zoom, I'll let Troy on Zoom have a comment here. He points out that the draw to Fox News is availability. too.
I would recommend reading chapters 1 and chapter 6 of my book. They go into significant detail about that shift and about that change. Blankenship does play a big role. There are a lot of factors involved. Media also plays a big role, but also as you mentioned, and it's something that's very significant. T.C. Townsend, the guy who defended the miners at the treason trials, he was a Republican. Of course, there were a lot of West Virginia politics. This was crazy. A lot of former socialists after the Socialist Party collapsed in West Virginia. And there was a fairly thriving Socialist Party in West Virginia. Harold Houston, one of the other two attorneys, he ran for governor twice on the Socialist ticket in West Virginia. But anyway, a lot of the former Socialists went into the Republican Party in the 1920s. For a lot of different reasons, one of which is that the Democratic Party was more closely tied to the KKK, and the UMWA would organize blacks and immigrants. And if you wanted to be pro-labor in West Virginia in the 20s, and you couldn't be a socialist, you were a Republican.
And a lot of African Americans were too.
Yes.
And you can also look and see how Southern Democrats, all of that totally switched. And those strong Southern Democrats that after the Civil War wormed their way back into power, and they were very, very conservative. And so then the Democrats, you take a state like Georgia's, mostly Republican now. And I agree with you that the labels don't really work too much today.
I think we've had a shift in population too, or the type of population. Back in the day, southern West Virginia was heavily populated. It was industrial. There were, I remember in the even 70s going to Logan and Williamson at the first of the month, and it was just a madhouse. There were just people everywhere, businesses, you see the old photos and stuff. But under the current power structure, what you have in southern West Virginia is if you have intelligence, or if you have a degree, or if you have ambitions, or you want a challenge in your life, you have to leave. There's nothing for you down there. You either dig coal, or you flip burgers, or you get out of town. And so there's this huge brain drain. Kids go to college. Like I say, if you have ambitions, you get out, you go somewhere else, because you're not going to find it down there. And so what's left are the elderly and the uneducated, and all your natural leaders are actually gone. And so it's easy to kind of fall in with all your neighbors and all that. you're seeing this, I think the Republicans are very good with the culture wars. They know how to play that, and the coal companies do the same thing. We know for a fact that certain coal companies had psychologists on their staff whose basic function was to determine how to divide communities. For instance, the union pretty much got, Von Blankenship pretty much busted the union in West Virginia for a long time, but he didn't clean it out. He could have. But what you did was, if you have union miners and non-union miners, they have different goals and different resources. So the guys who should be all on the same page are mortal enemies in some cases. So they're very slick about that. And I think that's part of it is very good with the culture wars. And then you have this kind of depleted population, all your just brain drain and the talent drain is just rather sad. All your natural leaders are somewhere else doing great things, unfortunately.
Out migration. That's what we're still in.
I was asked many times about media when the teacher strike was going on, how can this be happening in pro-Trump West Virginia? But one of the things that I tried to tell them, there's a difference between being pro-union and being a progressive.
Question, did radio play a role at all?
Well, I know Danny's gonna tell us, so I'm gonna leave it to Danny to tell us about it.
Can you tell us who you are? Because you know so many.
That's Danny Lutz, who lives over
Some
Charlestown Way, some point. And I guess I've known you like forever.
I forgot to mention, Danny's a playwright. He's written a play on the treason trials that will be in September, dates to be
We're
determined.
gonna try.
Pardon?
We're gonna try to
We're gonna
present
try.
in September.
And
Where?
it's
In
in
the
the
Jefferson County courtroom, but the trial took place.
So
Oh,
keep your eyes open for that.
And the trial took place in the same, I may be getting this wrong, correct me, in the same courtroom that John Brown was tried.
Same building.
Is that
Same.
correct?
same
Same
side.
building, different courtroom. So
Well,
it was the
well,
up, no?
So there's no upstairs at the time of the
Yeah.
John Brown trial. The courthouse was a single story. During the Civil War, it was destroyed. Following the Civil War in
Okay.
1872, it was
They
rebuilt.
rebuilt.
And so the room that is now the historic courtroom very much looks like as it did at the time of the miners' trial.
Is the historic courtroom, the historic courtroom still used as a courtroom?
I preside in that courtroom every day. So we use it as a courtroom. We put some speakers in and some other modern accoutrements, but it is the same courtroom. If you see the photographs of the miners' war trial, you'll notice both the molding in the courtroom, the lights, as well as the chairs. Quite a number of the chairs are still the very same chairs that we used at the time.
Okay, I think, did you have a question? And then Danny, after that, maybe you want to tell us about the radio?
Which,
So I serve with the Jefferson County Historic Landmarks Commission, and of course, the mine wars have very much been sort of in our thoughts the past couple of years. And one question that came up, and I don't know the answer to it, perhaps one of you do, was the courtroom integrated during the mine wars trials?
I think the answer is no.
Okay.
I'm not even sure it was integrated male-female very much yet. When it was rebuilt in 1872, we had a very modern creation, which was the ladies' viewing gallery up above the main courtroom floor, because the thought was that the ladies of Jefferson County were of sufficient thoughtfulness and intelligence that they would appreciate watching the men folk look down on the floor. And so we had that ladies' viewing gallery, which until fairly recently was still used sometimes.
That's where we got a redneck over.
Yeah. So did radio play a role in?
yes. Brag a little bit, but growing up, I was acquainted with James M. Mason, who was one of the defense attorneys, with George Baltzuber, to my regret, who was one of the prosecuting attorneys, Forrest Brown, who was an elder in the Presbyterian Church, and John T. Porterfield, who was the prosecuting attorney. And then the person I'm going to mention is most important here is Lawrence Lloyd, who was the Western Union operator in the Hotel Thomas Jefferson at the time. I didn't have the field of vision to realize what he was trying to tell me about. But first of all, KDKA came on the air in 1920, a year before. And then Lawrence Lloyd was telling me about this reporter from a New York radio station, WJZ, who would come to his Western Union desk around 4:30 every afternoon and give him a transcript in shorthand of the proceedings, and that Lawrence was, as he could, he was teletype, that is telegraphed this to WJZ in New York. Now, I didn't realize the significance, because WJZ came on the air in October of 1921. And in 1944, it became WABC, when it was bought by American Broadcasting Company. That, according to Elizabeth Nicoletti at WABC, that is probably the first trial for which the accounts were ever broadcast in the world.
Really?
And with that, I think we probably need to wrap things up.